Humanity has been bestowed with great gifts. Perhaps greatest of all is our imagination, because ultimately it's our imaginations that enable us to shape the world around us. The most obvious examples of that are the great buildings and architecture all around us. But which works of architecture should we see during our lifetimes? Find out in Top 10, The Art of Architecture. City squares, market squares, places, piazzas, plazas, they come in many shapes and sizes. Some rectangular, some round, and many with a layout deviating from simple geometric shapes. In terms of size alone, Tiananmen Square is almost 6 times larger than Red Square, which is in turn 6 times larger than the Piazza del Campo in Siena, yet each has a distinctive character. So now let's look at 10 of the world's most celebrated and distinctive city squares. Piazza San Marco, Venice, Italy. The legendary 1,000-year-old main square of Venice, Italy, forms the heart of the former maritime power, the Republic of Venice. This incredible city first took shape during the 7th century, spreading over 118 small islands floating on the waters of the lagoon. Altogether, it is an architectural masterpiece. Piazza San Marco, a vast arcaded square, is a showcase for the most impressive Venetian architecture. The most imposing building on the square is San Marco Basilica, which gives the square its name. The basilica was built in honor of St. Mark, the patron saint of Venice. One side of the square, of course, faces onto the lagoon.
It's like an inn-yard from 3 sides, but then it goes out in the lagoon where the water is. And this special town with only water around, you cannot dislike it. And there I really feel you come into another century.
St. Mark's personal symbol, a winged lion, can be found on many buildings in Venice. The present basilica was built in the 11th century and also served as a private chapel for the Doge of Venice, the city's chief magistrate. The basilica is Byzantine in design and is surmounted by 5 vaulted domes. The 4 Greek horses of gilded bronze on its facade were brought from 13th century Constantinople as spoils of war, although today's sightseers must be content with replicas. In front of the basilica, a 99-meter-high bell tower soars above Venice. It collapsed in 1902 and was rebuilt 10 years later, around a core of reinforced concrete sheathed in Venetian red clay brick. The square without its bell tower just wouldn't have been the same.
A lot of the square have the tower. St. Marco is kind of also open up to the sea, and therefore very often St. Marco is over flooded by the water. Of course that's a problem, but it totally changed the use of the square.
Piazza San Marco is a spectacular piece of historic urban planning, a wonderful mixture of open spaces and monumental buildings. Its play of light and shade, once seen, can never be forgotten. Red Square, Moscow, Russia. To visit our next square, we head for one of the largest and most expensive cities in the world, Moscow, Russia. The vast square is Red Square, and it covers 73,000 square meters. It is located just outside the northeastern wall of the Kremlin, former royal palace and now official residence of the President of Russia. The origins of Red Square are connected with the Kremlin, the fortified palace in the heart of Moscow. The square has its origins with the decision by Ivan the Great to rebuild the Kremlin. Thus it was, in 1493, all shops and stalls were moved outside its walls, and a market square beside the Kremlin was created. It's hard to imagine such an imposing place had such humble origins.
The problem with this kind of very big squares is that it's so big that it's also hard to relate with your body. Of course, it's very interesting to see because there's so much history in these squares. But maybe less useful when it comes to kind of daily life in a city.
Before the revolution of 1917, Red Square was in daily use as a huge marketplace and was simply called the Market. Piazza San Marco, Venice, Italy. The legendary 1,000-year-old main square of Venice, Italy, forms the heart of the former maritime palace. Rebuilt several times since the 16th century, the onion domes of this brick and stone cathedral were first painted brightly in 1848. In the 1930s, Stalin wanted St. Basil's torn down. He thought it got in the way of parades held on Red Square, but the demolition never happened. Two other buildings on the square were demolished by Stalin, but restored in the later part of the 20th century. One is the Resurrection Gate, a double passage gateway crowned by tinted roofs similar to the Kremlin towers. It connects the former Moscow City Hall with the State Historical Museum. The other was the Kazan Cathedral, originally built in 1636. Stalin made another significant change to Red Square. When the monument to Minin and Podzarsky, a bronze statue of two Russian heroes, was erected in 1818, it became Moscow's first sculptural monument. But Uncle Joe had it removed from its original position in front of the present-day department store GUM. The impressive GUM building was a high-end luxury enterprise of its own time. Built at the end of the 19th century, it combines elements of the Russian Revival style with a steel framework and a large glass roof.
The square was about the power, and you showed in a way the power. It was kind of the blanket for the king or for the government.
No visit to Red Square is complete without Lenin's mausoleum, where the embalmed body of Vladimir Lenin is on display. Once best known for Soviet military parades, today's Red Square is also a venue for celebrations, concerts, and folk festivals. But whatever the reason for visiting, there's nowhere else on Earth quite like it. Place de la Concorde, Paris, France. The beautiful Place de la Concorde is the largest square in Paris. It has been an integral part of the rich history of France since 1763, when it was called the Louis XV Square. Place de la Concorde, of course, translates pretty easily to the place of concord or harmony.
So there are also kind of windows into the soul of places, you know. You can look, it's like opening a body and looking inside it. So I think that this is the one thing that public squares mainly have.
Originally intended to cover a marshland, it was developed by an architect named Ange-Jacques Gabriel. It is 84,000 square meters in size, with its south side situated on the banks of the River Seine. To the east, it borders the famous Tuileries Gardens and Louvre Gallery, and on the west, the Champs-Élysées. Yet another Parisian landmark, the Arc de Triomphe, is easily visible from the square. The square's main feature is an obelisk over 20 meters tall with a golden pinnacle. This gem of the ancient world, covered with hieroglyphics, was originally from Luxor in Egypt and dates back to the 13th century BC. It replaced a statue of Louis XV on horseback, which was melted down in the French Revolution. Near the obelisk, there are two fountains in ancient Roman style. The northern fountain is decorated with allegories of agriculture and industry. The southern one with motifs of sailing and maritime themes. Both are exquisite, especially when lit up at night. The square is in fact octagonal in shape, and at each of its 8 points stands a sculpture representing an important French city, such as Strasbourg, Marseille, and Bordeaux. On the northern face of the octagon, there are two more buildings to admire, both designed by the same architect, Gabriel, the Hôtel de Crillon and the Ministry of the Navy. Hôtel de Crillon is still one of Paris's finest hotels. It was opened in 1909 and is still used to accommodate important state visitors. But the square itself is somewhere anyone can go, day or night.
The public spaces are also places to where people can see each other and lose the fear from each other.
On a normal working day, the Place de la Concorde is a very busy traffic junction. But during festive times, it takes on a wholly different character. On such days, there are parades watched by crowds of excited people when the square relives some of the majesty of its past. Times Square, New York City, USA. Quite possibly the most distinctive square in the world can be found in the heart of that city like no other, New York, of course. Times Square, known as the crossroads of the world, nearly 500,000 people pass through it on its busiest days. It is hard to miss for visitors to the city.
First time I was at Times Square, it was heavily snowing, so I was looking around, trying to find it, and it was lightening up the whole kind of New York, so it was very easy to find.
Located in Midtown Manhattan, Times Square is a bow-tied shaped space formed by the intersection of 7th Avenue and Broadway between 42nd and 47th Streets. In the 19th century, the area was known as Long Acre Square, occupied by horse traders, stables, and carriage works. But when a station on New York City's first subway system was planned for the square, the area began to attract interest. In 1902, the New York Times moved its headquarters to the square to build a brand new 25-story high-rise. The building was called the Times Tower and was back then the second tallest in the city. At the turn of the 20th century, a number of theatres opened up in the neighbourhood. Times Square and Broadway soon became the world-famous entertainment district it still is today. The character of Times Square has changed more than once over the years.
Three sides, it's almost like this, with a lot of traffic around. And it's more like advertising, blinking Las Vegas these days.
Since the early 1900s, Times Square has also been inextricably linked with giant billboards. Today, the iconic curved NASDAQ sign stands over 7 stories high, and the whole of Times Square is now a giant signpost covered by billboards and video screens. Other famous buildings in Times Square include ABC's Times Square studio, the Paramount Building, and the black glass One Astor Plaza with its white crown roof. It houses Viacom and MTV studios. The northern triangle of Times Square is sometimes treated separately and goes under the name Duffy Square, named after Francis P. Duffy, a military chaplain whose statue can be found there. The square's other bronze statue is of a composer, playwright, and actor, George M. Cohan, a legend of American musical theater. Today, Times Square is where New Yorkers gather to celebrate the coming of the new year. With its skyscrapers and flashing billboards, it's hard not to be overwhelmed by it, unless you see it every day. Plaza de Mayo, Buenos Aires, Argentina. Our search for the top 10 city squares takes us to the most European city in the southern hemisphere, Buenos Aires. The Plaza de Mayo is located in the center of the Argentine capital, a city where there is never a dull moment.
I like city squares very much, because that is made for the opinion, a lot amount very often of people. If something are wrong or right or happy or whatever, they can come there in a big group and they have power.
As its name suggests, Plaza de Mayo is most famous as focus point for the 1810 May Revolution, which led to independence from Spanish rule. Originally, Plaza de Mayo was two squares joined by a row of columns under which a market once flourished. But in 1884, the market was done away with, and the squares were united. Today, the square is surrounded on three sides by wide avenues. Tall palm trees separate road from paved pedestrian space, which is adorned by fountains and lawns.
It's really important with a lot of festivitas. I think the gatherings, that is really important for the country, and also to show the culture in the country, the traditional culture, the music.
Speaking of drama, on the square's fourth side stands the Casa Rosada, or Pink House, the seat of Argentine government. From Casa Rosada's balconies, successive leaders have addressed crowds gathered in the square below. Indeed, Casa Rosada may be familiar from newsreels or even from the 1996 film Evita, about the wife of President Juan Perón. Opposite is the so-called Cabildo. The present whitewashed neo-colonial building dates from 1940, when its colonial features were restored. The tower, the red roof, and the bars on the windows are intended to look as much as possible as they did in early 17th century colonial times. Among the square's important buildings is the Metropolitan Cathedral, a daunting colonial building with a severe 19th century neoclassical portico, but no towers. The center of the square is marked by the May Pyramid, an obelisk constructed for the first anniversary of the 1810 revolution. It was later reworked on a grander scale, so now the original monument is hidden within the newer one. At the top of the statue is a rather rebellious-looking image of liberty. Painted on the ground surrounding the pyramid is a scattering of white scarves. This represents the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, who gathered here every week from 1977 until 2006 to demand information about family who had disappeared during the military dictatorship of the 1970s and 80s. Plaza de Mayo has often provided the focus for protests in Buenos Aires and events that have shaped the colorful history of Argentina. All city squares have something in common. They are public areas, halls where the sky is the ceiling. As we move closer in time to our own era, we can see many were purposely designed or redesigned to serve as places for public gatherings. All the way from the militaristic mass parades of Red Square to the papal blessings given in St. Peter's Square. Tiananmen Square, Beijing, China. And now to one of the largest squares in the world. Covering around 40 hectares, Tiananmen Square is the center of Beijing, China. Its name comes from the Tiananmen Gate, or Gate of Heavenly Peace. Located at its northern end, the Tiananmen Gate guarded the imperial city, which included the palace complex of Chinese Ming Dynasty emperors, the legendary Forbidden City. There was open space in front of the gate even during the Ming Dynasty. However, in the 17th century, when the Qing Dynasty emperors began their 200-year-plus rule, the gate and the square were rebuilt. In the 20th century, the square witnessed a number of historic events. Tiananmen Square is impressive, but also somehow foreboding.
The Mao Zedong huge painting in the middle of it, and all the street lamps has cameras inside, and it's a lot of police and military around, and you just have the picture of these tanks, you know, we saw on television with this man. It doesn't go away from your head, you know, it's there when you are there.
Either way, the square is no stranger to protest. In 1919, demonstrations here paved the way for the rise of communism in China. In 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China in the square. And of course, it witnessed the protests of 1989, which ended in a brutal crackdown. Winding the clock back to 1959, the square was redeveloped that year to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. At that time, it almost quadrupled in size, and ancient imperial buildings were demolished, including the ceremonial Gate of China. During the 1950s, new buildings and monuments went up. The monument to the people's heroes was erected in the square's center. Dedicated to martyrs of the Chinese Revolution and war, it was constructed of white marble and granite. To the south of the monument is the 1977 Chairman Mao Memorial Hall, where the embalmed body of Mao Zedong is on display. The central north-south axis of the square ends at the monumental Zhengyangmen Gate. On the western side is the Great Hall of the People, built in 1959. It's a site for meetings of the Chinese Parliament and some other large events. Its main hall can seat more than 10,000 people. On the eastern side is the monumental National Museum of China. It is 40 meters tall and covers nearly 70,000 square meters. Today, it is one of the most visited museums in the world, with many fascinating relics from the Forbidden City.
The Forbidden City is amazing. I mean, one cannot say anything else. It's just fantastic.
Over the course of the 20th century, the square became known for its massive parades and gatherings, including protests. The square is impressive due to its size, but also thanks to its buildings, which combine elements of international modernism, socialist realism, and traditional Chinese architecture. Trafalgar Square, London, UK. It may come as a surprise that the next square is also one of the newest in the top 10. London's Trafalgar Square commemorates British Admiral Horatio Nelson's victory over France and Spain in the Napoleonic Wars at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Formerly a courtyard of royal stables, the area was redesigned by the celebrated architect John Nash in 1812. The northern part of the square was chosen as the site of the National Gallery, and it was considered to be the epicentre of London, accessible to all. The neoclassical National Gallery, which welcomes around 6 million visitors per year, was built in the 1830s, but has been expanded many times since.
It's important for demonstrations and happenings and so on. And I know the sculptures, they have one corner for contemporary artists there, because they never decided what to do on that corner. but it's not a place, you know, I would long to spend many hours on.
No matter how much time you want to spend on Trafalgar Square, it does feel like the crossroads of the world somehow. Until recently, it was a giant roundabout surrounded by roads. In 2003, however, the northern side of the square was closed to traffic, linking it directly to the National Gallery. Nonetheless, traffic is still quite heavy around the other three sides of the square. London's iconic black cabs and red double-decker buses can be spotted around here at just about any time, day or night. The dominant feature of the square is, of course, Nelson's Column, erected in 1843. The towering granite monument is topped by a statue of Lord Nelson by E.H. Bailey, whose father had carved figureheads for ships. 4 bronze lions lie at the corners of the plinth, and bronze panels at its base depict Nelson's battles, including the Battle of Trafalgar, where Nelson died a hero's death. Fountains were added to the square in the 1840s too, but the present fountains were designed by the architect Edwin Lutyens in the 1930s. In recent years, the fountains were provided with LED lights, and their pumps, located below the square, were restored. Over the course of the 19th century, 4 plinths were laid to carry bronze statues, but for many years only 3 of them were occupied. Recently, the 4th plinth has become a temporary exhibition space for contemporary sculptures, and the others are occasionally subject to some unconventional decorations. Trafalgar Square is, of course, a venue for numerous events, including political rallies and demonstrations. But for around 70 years, it has also been the location for the London Christmas tree, donated by the people of Norway in gratitude for Britain's support during World War II. Piazza del Campo, Siena, Italy. The centre of Siena in central Italy is a picture-perfect medieval city. We can thank strict building regulations introduced in the 13th century for that. That's when Siena was at its peak as a hub for commerce and banking. Playing by the rules created an outstanding ensemble of Italian Gothic architecture. Siena is of course famous for the Palio, the annual horse race held in the city's main square, Piazza del Campo.
I've been to the race, and then the whole city is divided up in different zones, and they have their own animals where they have on the flags. And then when the race day, everybody, so the whole square is packed with people.
Siena was built on 3 hills, from which 3 major roads lead to a valley with a marketplace, the Piazza del Campo. By the 6th century, Siena was already on an important route to Rome. By the 12th century, the marketplace was divided by a wall, creating a civic plaza in front of the first city hall.
The square is more kind of going down to the tower, so it's nearly like an amphi. So yeah, it's a common kind of mark that you have the tower, or you have the church, or you have the museum, or.
In the 13th and 14th centuries, the piazza acquired its present semicircular shape, and construction of a Palazzo Pubblico, the town hall, began. It was to be the seat of the Council of 9, who ruled the city-state of Siena in those days. The palazzo, with a central 4-story tower, is located at the lower end of the sloping piazza. Its interiors were decorated by masters of the Sienese school, who were to have quite an influence on Italian art. The palazzo's central tower is overshadowed, however, by the 14th century red brick Torre de Mangia, or Tower of the Eater. The tower is topped by a striking marble belfry. In the 14th century, the piazza was also paved in its distinctive pattern. 9 tapered strips of brick, a herringbone pattern complemented by grey stone ribs. The square was embellished with a fountain, the Fonte Gaia, and consecrated with a chapel, the Cappella della Piazza. In addition to the town hall, Piazza del Campo is surrounded by several other palaces, including the Palazzo Senzodoni, opposite the Palazzo Pubblico, and the 18th century Palazzo Cigisondadari. The medieval Piazza del Campo is venue for the traditional bareback horse race, the Palio de Siena. This originated in the Middle Ages and has been held in the square for centuries. 10 horses and their riders race around the square, hoping to win the Palio, a richly decorated banner for their contrada, or city ward. Whether you come to see the Palio or to admire Siena's fantastically preserved Gothic heart, Piazza del Campo will not disappoint. Jama El Fana, Marrakesh, Morocco. Jama El Fana in the city of Marrakesh, Morocco, has a special place among our top 10 squares. It's not so famed for its architecture, but is an authentic market square straight out of the pages of history. Market squares were once at the very crossroads of ancient trade routes. However, Jama El Fana still is such a marketplace. It is bustling with trade, entertainment and refreshments even today, just as it has been for around 1,000 years.
I think it's one of the most magic marketplaces and in the world, you know, and it is lively today.
The square is on UNESCO's representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. In fact, it was the unique Moroccan traditions concentrated in Jama El Fana that led to UNESCO's creation of an intangible and oral heritage list in the first place. In the evening, the square is emptied and groups from all over set up rows and rows of food stalls. An hour later, and practically the whole square has become one large open-air restaurant. The cooks prepare the meals in front of the customers who dine together on low benches. Although Jama El Fana doesn't compare architecturally with some of the squares we have seen, its captivating atmosphere has an authentic flavour of the spirit and variety of medieval market squares. St. Peter's Square, Vatican City, Italy. Probably the most famous square of all is in the world's smallest state, Vatican City. Vatican City, of great importance to some 1.2 billion Catholics, is situated entirely inside Rome, and St. Peter's Square marks its easternmost border with Italy.
Yeah, the square is very related to the entrance of the Vatican. So it's kind of also where the Pope is speaking. So it's a square that is very kind of, the surrounding of the square is very kind of like a scenography of where the focus point is.
St. Peter's Basilica, adjacent to the square, is a site of pilgrimage. From its balcony, the Pope famously gives his Ubi et Orbi blessing. The history of the square, which was designed by the architect and sculptor Gian Lorenzo Bernini between 1656 and 1667, is firmly connected with the basilica that dominates it. The first stone for the new basilica had been laid in 1506, but it took another 120 years of work by many outstanding artists, including Michelangelo, before it was completed in 1626. Bernini, who had also worked on the basilica, was asked by Pope Alexander VII to transform the space in front of it to accommodate the crowds of pilgrims gathering for the papal blessing. Limited by the surrounding buildings, he designed a square made up of two different areas, a forecourt with a staircase leading to the basilica, and a huge oval surrounded by 4 rows of columns.
You know, it goes a little bit up, the feeling, so it is like a stage.
His design was compared to the welcoming arms of the Mother Church. Bernini's pupils embellished the columns with the statues of some 140 saints. In the center of the oval stands the Vatican obelisk. This had been brought to Rome by the infamous Emperor Caligula, then moved to the front of the basilica in 1586 on the orders of Pope Sixtus V. The 2 fountains either side of the obelisk were not created by the same sculptor. Bernini built the second in 1675 to complement the first, which had stood in the square since 1614. Bernini had also originally planned to screen the square from the approach road. Striving for a surprise effect for those entering. However, after Pope Alexander VII died, construction was halted and the vestibule was not built. On the contrary, in the 20th century, the old narrow streets were demolished and a broad avenue leading to the Vatican Basilica was opened. Nonetheless, entering the square is still awe-inspiring, and Bernini's greatest architectural achievement is much imitated but never matched for sheer grandeur. There is another way to view the square, and that is from atop of the dome of the basilica. From this perspective, it seems even more majestic. Open urban space in the middle of a city has long provided a fashionable showcase for architecture, reflecting both wealth and prestige. But they have also been the setting for both everyday life and unique special occasions. Many European medieval squares started as marketplaces at the crossroads of trade routes. More recent squares were often conscious of presenting the best of a country's architectural heritage and urban design. All of them places where humanity gathers to look at itself.